An analysis of the conclusion to the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. As impose other journey tales, at the height of his suffering, there is an excitation of the soul, a condition near ecstasy. Pym remains a passive character throughout the story, one to whom things happen. He goes on being naive and unknowing in the midst of his adventures. He does not recognize where he is going or why. That is for the reader of the narrative to comprehend. What does the ending mean? Does Pym perish in the white spray? If so, how can we find him alive and well in New York City in July 1838, having, he tells us in the introductory note to his narrative, returned from his South Sea adventure by way of Richmond, Virginia, where it was only the urging of Mr. Poe to complete his memoirs to print. Those critics who think the ending an imposture, how could Pym have survived to tell the tale, have opined in ignorance of a theory of the circulation of oceans, which Poe, like many other Americans in the 1830s, took seriously. This was the then famous Sims notion, published in 1826 and popularized by the magazine writer Jeremiah Reynolds, who also wrote an account, which Melville read, of a white whale in the Pacific. The Sims theory proposed that the earth was hollow and currents of the seas all poured through a vortex at the South Pole, emerging at the North Pole and recirculating around the globe. Once this idea is entertained, it is evident that Pym and Peters need not perish when their canoe hurtles into the vortex. They have gone down into the vortex and have been cast up alive. But if Pym is back in New York City, what sort of hoax have he and Poe played on us with their supposed cataclysm at the end of the manuscript? Suppose we remember that in this tale, everything that happens is repeated, is itself a repetition of what has gone before, and a precursor to that which is to come. All departures, entombments, aboard and ashore, all the vertiginous moments, those awakenings from horror into ecstasy, into horror, into yet further excitations of the soul. The self is born and reborn. Pym's and Peters' final voyage suggest that they sailed, or rather were sucked into the vortex at the South Pole and re-emerged at the North. Sims' theory was a concept widely accepted during Poe's time. Consider Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. Here's Pym's theory represented graphically. The suggestion of the vortex and Sims' hole at the poles leads us to imagine a visual representation of Pym's voyages. Figure 2 suggests that each voyage gets bigger, but that each previous is contained within. Figure 3 projects the same idea, but the voyages are each different. Figure 4, perhaps, is the best representative, since it shows that each voyage gets larger, that each previous voyage is contained within the next, and that each voyage has the same starting point. Left small is the first voyage in the North Atlantic on a small sloop. Left middle represents the second North Atlantic voyage on a seafaring whaling vessel. Right middle suggests Jane Guy, another large seafaring merchant vessel in the South Seas. Right small suggests a canoe to the South Pole, also in the South Seas. Outside, we have an infinity symbol, voyage of life that never ends as the character is reborn, and representing the never-ending repetition of Pym's trials and tribulations. Was Sim's theory so crazy? Not if we look at geomagnetism. Both the visual representation of Sim's theory and my figure 5 suggest a magnetic field. I have a theory about Poe's construction of the story. Its repetitive, ever-increasing voyages are meant to represent the magnetic field surrounding the Earth and prefigure the ending of the novel. Poe was an avid reader. One of the major topics of his day was the developing understanding of electromagnetism. Simon Denis Poisson, 1781 to 1840, developed one of the first mathematical theories of magnetism. Poisson's model, developed in 1824, the revolution began when Hans Christian Ørsted discovered that an electrical current generates a magnetic field that encircles the wire. In a quick succession, that discovery was followed by André-Marie Ampère, showing that parallel wires having currents in the same direction attract, and by Jean-Baptiste Biot and Félix Savart, developing the correct equation, the Biot-Savart law, for the magnetic field of a current-carrying wire. In 1825, Ampère extended his revolution by publishing his Ampere's law, which provided a more mathematically subtle and correct description of the magnetic field generated by a current than the Biot-Savart law. Subsequent development in the 19th century interlinked magnetic and electrical phenomena even tighter until the concept of magnetic charge was not needed. Magnetism became an electric phenomenon, with even the magnetism of permanent magnets being due to small loops of current in their interior. This development was aided greatly by Michael Faraday, who in 1831 showed that a changing magnetic field generates an encircling electric field. All of the excitement about magnets and electricity that was current in the news starting in 1820 and continuing for the rest of Poe's life most likely would have called attention to William Gilbert's work in 1600 that theorized that the Earth is a giant magnet that is surrounded by magnetic fields. So a comparison of the magnetic fields surrounding the Earth that derive from Gilbert's theory of geomagnetism and Sim's theory of the hollow Earth is not so far-fetched, except that instead of having water flowing from the South Pole to the North Pole, we have magnetic fields flowing from the South Pole to the North Pole. I maintain that Poe was aware of this on some level and consciously envisioned the story in terms of these fields. Poe gives us plenty of hints in the story regarding his interest in geometric shapes. For example, the rookery of the albatross and penguins, which could extend to infinity, or his detailed description of the layout of the chasms in chapter 23 that lead to a possible cryptogram, as we discovered in the note at the end of the novel. Then we also have Pym's description of the aurora australis, suggesting that Poe was aware of the effects of the magnetic field converging at the poles. Is this theory far-fetched? And another important aspect of the novel is the discussion of color. The novel uses whiteness and blackness, especially after the arrival on Tzitzal, in racial terms and as symbols. There is a racially charged depiction of the natives and the supposed superiority of the white men. And then there is the question of the white figure whom the natives obviously fear, to the point that Nunu drops dead from fear. Poe wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym during a crucial period in the history of race in America. Beginning in the late 1820s, the debate over slavery became increasingly contentious. Abolition was another of the major discussions in the time that Poe was writing the novel. But the issue of race comes up before chapter 18. Where else? We've mentioned Peters already, who's a mixed race. The other character is the black cook on the Krampus. In reading the text, the cook seems to have little significance in the story until we meet the Thessalians. As Pym presents it, the cook helps lead the uprising aboard the Krampus, acting more viciously than any other mutineer. The cook represents unrestrained violence, the kind of behavior imagined in racist conceptions of African American identity. The representation of the cook foreshadows the violence of the Thessalians and Pym's representation as the most, quote, fiendish race of man upon the face of the globe, on page 1174. Poe's desire to keep the tension in the story high drives him to tap into the racial stereotypes and fears that would register with many of his readers. So he provides for his white audience terrifying images of a world dominated by blackness. The message that comes out of the final chapters of Pym is that a world run by black-skinned people is savage and violent. It is not civilized. So Poe resorts to stereotypes about Africans in his depiction of the Thessalians. But looking at it from another perspective, the Thessalians clearly understand what Captain Guy has in mind for them. So the massacre could be read as self-defense. What are your thoughts? So all of this blackness becomes a stark contrast with the pervasive whiteness that ends the novel. This is the most perplexing part of the novel and the most debated. One is tempted to compare chapter 25 to chapters 18 through 22, but what characterizes chapter 25 is absence, not presence. There is some counterpoint to the blackness, but the enveloping whiteness and the huge shrouded human figure, quote, colored the perfect whiteness of snow, resist stable interpretation. One thing is clear, is the pervasive sense of power that ends the novel. So what is Poe saying about whiteness? Who is the white figure at the end of the novel? The lack of real narrative closure not only is part of Poe's narrative strategy, but also points to the difficulties in representing a stable form of white identity, distinguishable from the identities of racial others. Is the white figure God or death, switching the usual metaphor of death from black to blinding light? Is the end just nothingness? Jules Verne wrote in 1897 The Sphinx of Ice, in which he attempted to finish Pym's story. The story is told by an American naturalist named Jerling, who signs on to a Captain Len Guy's ship, the brother of Poe's William Guy. Len Guy tells Jerling that he tried to find Pym and even Poe himself. On board the ship is none other than Dirk Peters. The ship goes to the South Pole and has similar experiences to Pym's narrative. Is the whole story a dream? Its ending sure seems like one. Does the narrative end with Pym falling asleep in the box on the Krampus and all the rest is a dream? There never was a mutiny, and in the box he sleeps and almost meets death. Prior to his falling asleep in the box, the world seemed pretty rational. After that, it gets more and more fantastic. Does Pym grow in the novel? He exhibits psychological growth, but his growth is best represented mathematically by a sine wave. Starting at 0, his growth is up and down in an undulant manner throughout the book. He escapes his parents only to be entombed alive. He is released from his prison only to be tortured by a storm. He hopes to be saved by a ship only to find it desolate. He is rescued by the Jane Guy only to be entombed again in a cavern on Sisal. Yet with each experience he grows. His awareness becomes more acute until the final scene he is reborn, in Blake's sense, into innocence, as suggested by the white, pure, almost celestial South Pole. Throughout the novel, new hopes are constantly destroyed by perverse twists of fate. Pym escapes his parents, but is confronted by his grandfather. He deceives his grandfather by pretending to be a drunken sailor. He deceives the crew of the Krampus, but becomes a prisoner of the crew. He welcomes the arrival of his dog, only to be surprised by the dog's attack. He finds hope in discovering a bottle of wine, but is deceived by his companions when they drink it in his absence. But, ironically, he is spared the tormenting thirst that they experience after drinking the port. He is saved by the Jane Guy, but deceived again by being abandoned on Sisal. Yet, what makes them ironic is that most of them are self-induced. So, if one follows the interpretation of Pym's psychological growth, then at the end of the novel, Pym is reborn. However, if one follows the theme of deception, then ultimately Pym is deceived. He is denied rebirth at the moment that he expects it. We never know if he discovers the ultimate truth of reality. The novel ends in some sense like Coleridge's Kubla Khan, where the poet awakes from his dream and forgets most of the details, leaving the poem incomplete, as does Pym awake from his dream, leaving the narrative unfinished. In any case, Pym does not transcend reality and grasp an ideal truth. Pym's last trip is undertaken on purpose, but the voyage through the veil is not the immediate end in view for Arthur Gordon Pym. It is only the last of many voyages in his narrative. He sails in no fewer than 5 vessels, and his tale is a harrowing sequence of entombments alive, mutiny, and murder, of survival through hurricane, starvation, and cannibalism, encounters with the dangerous beast and savage tribes. Most of these motifs are duplicated and reduplicated in a fashion like that of dream work. They seem obsessive as Pym escapes from horror in order to endure horror yet again.